Buddy, it is Friday. It's Friday. That's what day it is. It's the CUI Hotline. Daniel's out of the office. Finally, dude does not take enough time out of the office. Anybody who knows him and how hard he works. So we're joined by the great and powerful Scott Edwards, who runs the show around here, literally. And Brad Shannon. Haven't seen you in a while, Brad, director of product management on the managed services side of the house. I'm going to get it right one day. Let's see. We're live on YouTube. We're live on LinkedIn. So you can add to the chat if you got questions, comments, concerns, compliments. Still light on the compliments. So feel free to throw those in, everybody. You can go to the CUIHotline.org. You can fill out the form over there. You can call the number, leave a voicemail. That's always fun. And we got a huge queue of questions from comments and things that were sent to us. We were just in Dallas this week, or sorry. We were just in Fort Worth this week at Summit 7 Live. So we got some good questions there. And so we got the triple show here, so we can get right into week in review like always. Scott, there's a lot of companies out there with level 2 certifications at this point. It's pretty amazing. We're over 1,000 level 2 certifications, and some C3PAOs out there are crossing the 100 assessment mark.
Thoughts? It's great. I mean, Fernando came out yesterday and mentioned that they have hit 100 assessments, which is fantastic. I think he's actually at 105. I had a short phone call with him yesterday and congratulated him on that. So that's great. 105 assessments for I think it's for InfoSec investments. So they're doing a great job over there. They've helped a lot of companies get through their assessment process. We're sitting at 87 now, so we're right on his heels. I will say though, Summit 7's, the implementation side takes a little bit more time, a little bit more difficult than the 2, 3, 4, 5 day assessments. So, congratulations, Fernando, but we're right there behind you. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it is super impressive that he's run. I almost closed out of the stream while it was running. That would have been really fun. 87 level 2 certified clients on our end. We get this question all the time, especially when we do some of our live events. We are not a C3PAO. We do not conduct assessments because you can't eat your own dog food, which totally makes sense, not just in the CMMC world, but if the person who did the work is also evaluating their work, you're probably not going to get the best, most objective results, right? Scott, I don't know if we've talked about this on the stream before. Why did we not become a C3PO? Why did we stick with just the services side?
Yeah, it's a great question because we actually toyed with that idea for a period of time. And we thought about doing that, and we decided, we're trying to build an ecosystem here. We're trying to build an entire ecosystem that can support OSCs. And we felt that it would be better. We would be better served, and the ecosystem would be better served if we supported the C3PAO ecosystem separately and partnered with various C3PAOs rather than essentially competing with our friends in all of the C3PAOs out there. So we made a very conscious decision to not go the C3PAO route. That being said, we still have, we have, I don't know, I think it's 6 or 7 lead CCAs on staff. We have, oh Lord, and we have, 30 plus CCPs. I mean, so we have all the same certifications and capabilities, and we have a huge a huge compliance team approaching 30 people now that do nothing but assessments and assessment support. But we don't compete with C3PAOs on the actual for record assessments. That was a very conscious decision we made. And it's worked out really well. We love partnering with C3PAOs and giving our OSC customers a number of C3PAOs that we know do good work that they can go choose from. And so Fernando's one of those, and we have others as well.
Yeah, awesome. All righty. Moving right along here, this Stryker hack, if you haven't been reading the news, Stryker is, I think, the largest manufacturer in the country, maybe in the world of medical devices and things like that, basically in the medical system. Stryker makes everything. And things are popping off in the Middle East, as they do from time to time. And so as a result, either state affiliated or state sponsored cyber actors hacked into the Stryker enterprise, got into the admin accounts, and used features of the Intune system to basically wipe their entire ecosystem off the map. So this was not a fatal flaw in how Intune works. This was Intune being used to do normal Intune feature things in a malicious way, which are almost always the most powerful ways to do things that are nefarious, malicious, destructive, things like that. They are not breaking a Microsoft solution. They're using it the way that you could use it if you had bad intentions. So first thing here on this one, the group that so far has been associated with this hack is an Iranian threat actor group called Muddy Water. They all have these strange names if you're not familiar with cyber threat intel activity. We recently did the podcast, which was a follow-up and summary of my CS5 presentation from last fall about how well do the NIST standards in 800-171 map to the known techniques used by Iranian threat actors. One of the threat actors that we evaluated in that analysis was Muddy Water. So we've got the blog on our website. We've got the podcast from a couple of weeks ago. Go check that out. As it turns out, the standards in 800-171 map very well to the techniques that are used by acting or threat actor groups like Muddy Water, even though that's not necessarily what NIST intended when they tailored that baseline. And now as more and more information about the Stryker hack is coming out, it turns out it wasn't some crazy alien 0-day hyper advanced capability. It was old accounts, crappy passwords, accounts, shared accounts on admin privileges who have access to global Intune dashboards. And that's what they did. And now all of a sudden, we're dealing with the fallout there. So check out those resources for information on how the controls actually mitigate activity like this. Your guys' thoughts on abusing Intune, because this happens. People are like, oh, it's a Microsoft thing, so it's a Microsoft flaw, and that's not the story.
Yeah, it definitely wasn't the story. I mean, Intune did exactly what Intune was supposed to do. The problem was in both the account management that Stryker was using to manage their administrative accounts. And then, I don't believe, based on what I've read, I don't think they had things like privileged identity management turned on. So they didn't have kind of the second key, if you will, to approve an administrative action. So that is something, a configuration failure from a Stryker standpoint. Yeah, it was just a bad configuration that led to the 200,000 devices being wiped.
Yeah.
That is just, for most companies that would essentially be an extinction event for the business. We'll see how Stryker is able to recover.
Yeah.
But yeah, terrible problem. Terrible.
To be fair, when you're a small company without a lot of budget, not a lot of revenue, keeping up with security requirements like that is a big lift. And Stryker only does 25 billion in revenue, so we got to cut them a little bit of slack. You know what I mean? Like it happens. Like we got a lot of stuff going on. Cut them a break. Am I right, everybody?
Yeah, they're probably like, we don't need to get, assessed and certified because we're too small. Nobody's going to come after us, right? We're only 25 billion.
Man. Yeah. So, Cyber Ninja's got a good question here. Do you guys have thoughts on Intune multi-admin approval?
Yeah. I mean, that's basically what I was just talking about was, privileged identity management. When you get access to administrative, capabilities and functions, you have to essentially have a second admin approve the actions. So it's, that I highly recommend that. We put that on pretty much all of our clients. We have it internally in our environment. I am paranoid. And so, we try to have as many of those kinds of steps in place for ourselves and for our customers. And it is, many people don't like it. Many admins really find it annoying because they don't have the ability to do things in the environment without additional approvals. But
But this is
if
why
you don't do it, this is why. This is
This
exactly why.
Yep.
Well, that's the same complaint that you heard when MFA was introduced. It's
Yeah,
like, oh,
for sure.
one more step to get in, right? I mean, but cybersecurity is not there to make it easier to do what you want to do. It's there to slow you down a little bit, make sure you're doing the right thing, and not, somebody's not getting in there to do the wrong thing. Because if it's easy for you, it's going to be easier for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think joke of the day goes to Blue Siren. That's excellent pun. Striker struck out. So that was really good. All righty. Talking about other fun things, Brad, you got a double whammy here in terms of weekend review and thoughts. Printing sucks. This is something I think there's a lot of things we can all disagree on in the world these days. I think this is one thing that we can all agree on. What are your
anybody who's tried to print anything and it's like, well, it's sitting in the print queue, but it's not coming out of the printer. Why is it not coming out of the printer? I mean, like
PC load in general.
Yeah, I mean, it's like it's 2026, right? I mean, printing should be a lot easier. Anyway, so if you're using an enclave, if you're trying to remain cloud only, and you also need to print, it's a very difficult situation to make sure that you're doing it compliant, because you're having to bring in on-prem things into scope, and it expands your assessment boundary. And so we're always trying to figure out ways to keep that assessment boundary very tight, very small, without having to bring in a lot of other devices if a client is trying to stay in an enclave. So we've got some solutions and some things that we're working on for on-prem printing. Of course, you're not going to do anything else, right? I mean, how else are you going to get the paper? But printing is just very difficult. It's one of those things just is a little bit unique, and it's not an easy thing to solve for.
Yeah. Well, I guess your other half here, weekend review, you've been talking to people. I mean, I think you even said this morning about increasingly tight timelines are being handed down, typically from the primes, and people are then negotiating terms into trying to navigate what's going on. What are you seeing here?
Yeah, so I mean, this happens all the time, where you get a company that's like, well, this doesn't match the way we do business, and we need to negotiate on some term, right? Or it could be all the terms. It could just be whatever they want to negotiate on, and we're constantly talking and back and forth. And if you've got a very tight deadline where you've got 3 months, 6 months, whatever, that you've got to be assessed, there's not a whole lot of time to have back and forth on T's and C's and MSA and all those kinds of things. So at some point, there's got to be a little bit of like, okay, this is the best we can do. We're gonna move forward with this, so we can just get assessed. So that's a tough balance to strike. I understand, for businesses, especially larger businesses. There's a lot of red tape, a lot of processes, a lot of people that have to approve things. So it's definitely something that I see, increasing frustration as we're getting close to that drop dead date of, we got to sign by this date, and we've still got a lot of things that we've got to negotiate. So yeah, it's a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen working with especially some multinationals and those kinds of things, MSA negotiations, term negotiations that have drawn out for 3-4+ months, which is pretty wild, and it just continues to delay implementation. So
yeah, I mean, sometimes 3-4 months sounds like that would be good on some of these. I mean, it's 6+ months of back and forth, and it can take time, and gotta go through a lot of hands.
Yeah, absolutely. All righty. Nicholas, has there been any word on when 171 Rev 3 will be the standard that C3PAOs assess to? Is there a future revision of 171 we should be preparing for? So 171 Rev 3 will be the baseline that C3PAOs assess after what you could refer to it as CMMC 3.0 is in effect. So 32 CFR 170 is the CMMC program regulation. That has to be modified via rulemaking in order to point to 171 Rev 3. After that's done, then the CAICO, the Cyber AB, all those guys have to update all of the information, all the training, all the stuff, which in my opinion, they don't need to wait to do that, but I'm not in charge. And then from there, they'll start rolling out the assessments against 171 Rev 3. If you recall, The language in DFARS Clause 7012 doesn't specify a revision. The language in 7012 says you have to implement the most current version of 171 at the time of solicitation. That's a problem because back in 2016, when that rule went into effect, they were a lot looser about estimating costs, burdens, and things like that from imposing these requirements on contractors. By the time CMMC rulemaking happened, they said you need to specifically estimate against a specific revision. So they issued what's known as a class deviation for DFARS 7012, essentially a temporary waiver of the language that said, do 171 revision 2 until we tell you otherwise. Everything that we've heard is that that class deviation will be updated to Rev 3 when CMMC 3.0 rulemaking is done. Everything that we've heard about rulemaking is it's ready to go. It's happening. They have everything on deck for that process to start. But as we all know, rulemaking always takes longer than people think. In my opinion, I would say the soonest you would start to see 171 Rev 3 in a final version of CMMC 3.0 would be end of this year. If things start to speed up, things tend to slow down in the summer. Who knows, right? So I would say it's not going to be anytime soon. As far as Rev 3 goes, you're going to know 6 to 18 months ahead of time when it starts to make noise. So there's still plenty of time. As far as future revisions of 171, the 171 revision 4 won't occur until 853 revision 6, because we had 853 revision 4, and then we derived the original 171. We had 853 revision 5, which then triggered 171 revision, which is revision 3. Once we go to 853 revision 6, that would give us 171 revision 4. That's way down the line. So I wouldn't worry about anything beyond revision 3 anytime soon.
So I would expect that we will probably get a cost estimate for the one-time engineering uplift from R2 to R3 as part of that rulemaking process, right?
This is a good question, and I'm not sure that we will, because I still think that you're going to see the difference in assessment time, 171 Rev 2 to 171 Rev 3. But the CMMC program is still not the rule that's making contractors implement.
Oh, that's a really good point.
171 Rev 3. It's still 7012.
Well, yeah, but I mean, we're talking about a 7012 update, right?
No, they would just update the class deviation. So the CMMC program would.
So you don't think? So I thought I had been thinking that we were going to get a 7012 revision within the next 12 months as well. And so my expectation had been that, as part of that 7012 revision, we would see things like, a final determination with FedRAMP moderate equivalency, a tying of, removing the, most current version, 170, 171, language out and tying it to R3, those kinds of modifications in 7012.
Yeah, there's definitely modifications that the department wants to make to 7012, getting rid of covered defense information as a term, getting rid of the floating variable of the revision and specifying a revision, getting rid of equivalency. In my conversations with people inside of the Undersecretary for Acquisition and Sustainment office, there's currently not a lot of appetite for them to go through that 7012 rulemaking anytime soon for various reasons. So essentially, until there's pressure on them to do that, which I would like them to do that, they can just keep looping these class deviations indefinitely. And they can say, okay, we're on Rev 3, go do Rev 3. We're on Rev 4, go do Rev 4. And so even though the CMMC program would be the trigger for them to update the class deviation, the 7012 clause is still the thing making you implement the requirements.
So they wouldn't have to do price. They wouldn't have to do any cost.
Yeah, now they'll do a delta for what it costs to assess Rev 3, but the underlying basis that CMMC is just there to assess a thing that the other clause made you implement means that the CIO's office is not going to assess or estimate the cost of implementation. Now,
that's interesting.
That may be different when we move to 172 Rev 3, because DFARS 7012 doesn't mention 800 172, which is another reason why they should be doing DFARS 7012 rulemaking. But then again, this is a very opaque process, and we don't have any visibility into. So they could come out with a proposed rule for 7012, in August or something, and
or you could just put out a document and just completely bypass rulemaking like GSA. I mean, who needs rulemaking,
who
right?
needs the rules? Yeah, exactly.
Nobody needs rulemaking. We can just put out a document.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you guys are tuned into the podcast, into the YouTube channel, into our LinkedIn content, things like that, you will know immediately as soon as we know that there's some sort of movement on any of the rulemaking fronts. But that's all the information that we have so far.
Yeah.
I've got a follow-up question on the Rev 3. We've had some questions about where's AI come in to all this, and my initial response is implement the controls that you're already required to implement and follow the data, right? So, feeding ITAR and CUI into any old model that's out there through AI tools, obviously, if you're following the data and securing your data, you're not doing that right. So do we expect to see, the NIST AI RMF be applied at some point? Like, how do we think that that's going to happen?
There definitely won't be. Well, it's definitely not in Rev 3. I doubt it's going to be in CMMC 3.0 rulemaking unless they restart the internal rulemaking process, which could happen. That would add a lot more time until we see CMMC 3.0 rules come out, which isn't necessarily the worst thing. But I don't think you're going to see anything like that anytime soon. The best way I've heard it described, and honestly, I agree with this take, is that all of the AI problems are just a rebrand of shadow IT problems. You're like, you're not controlling what your employees are doing in terms of where they're sticking your data, where they're logging in and where the data is flowing. Like you said, like you can call it AI, you call it shadow IT. It's the same fundamental data flow control issue. So, you could do the same thing here with, quantum resistant encryption, things like that. Will that eventually show up in the baseline? Yeah, but because of the tight alignment to NIST standards, which was the guiding policy for CMMC 2.0, unless the DoD changes their approach here, which I doubt they're going to, I don't think they're going to unilaterally start bringing in specific mentions of AI, specific mentions of quantum, specific mentions of all these other issues until NIST does. So I would say that would probably be CMMC 4.0. Doesn't prevent you from dealing with those issues, but I just don't know if it's going to work its way into the rulemaking process proactively.
Highly recommend that companies start putting together an AI governance policy internal to their organization. Not required by CMMC, but still, you need it. And follow that up with some blacklisting and whitelisting, if you want to pull it back to 800-171 controls.
Yeah. I mean, it's the same thing with zero trust, right? People are like, when are we going to move from 171 to zero trust? Zero trust is just 171 at a more granular level. I mean, these are least privilege, your access control policies, all that stuff is just on steroids when you do it at a zero trust level. So there's no conflict between any of these ideas. And to your point, you don't have to wait on NIST and DoD to tell you how to adapt these things, but a lot of people wait until it's required for them to adapt.
People don't wait until they're forced to do the right thing.
Yeah. All right. Brett said, any opinions on how the ProPublica report on GCC High could impact CMMC? Well, it won't, because
it won't.
GCC High and issues uncovered during the reporting, or alleged issues uncovered during the reporting, don't have anything to do with CMMC. There is no relationship between CMMC and GCC High directly. You are not required to use GCC High by CMMC. CMMC is a verification mechanism for contractual cybersecurity requirements. Now, if you have data sovereignty requirements resulting from ITAR, export control, EAR, things like that, then there are restrictions on the type of cloud enclaves you can put that data into, which is why companies like Microsoft created sovereign cloud offerings like GCC High so that they can have offerings that are compliant with those things. Most people weren't really paying attention to those issues until CMMC came by and started exposing these regulatory compliance and technical debts. So a lot of people conflate CMMC with GCC High, but giant tech corporation has issue with agreements with the government, right? Spin the wheel on which Oracle, Amazon, Google, Microsoft. I mean, one of these things comes out every few months. So no direct impact in terms of CMMC, and no direct impact on people using GCC High who have CMMC obligations. I mean, do you have any thoughts here, Scott?
Yeah, I mean, we see these kinds of articles come out on a pretty regular basis, and like you said, it can be Oracle, it can be Microsoft, it can be Google, it can be whoever. It strikes me as a hit piece type article. Somebody decided that they wanted to go write something about, they have a burr about Microsoft, and so they've, grabbed onto a story and are working to make it into something. I was pretty close to the people that were working the FedRAMP issues. There were some significant disagreements between the FedRAMP staff and the Microsoft staff working the FedRAMP problems or issues or what have you, and that did delay the process. In there were some quotes about some from various Microsoft people about, hey, being excited that they finally finished the FedRAMP process. Big surprise, right? Microsoft is celebrating, finally getting through the FedRAMP process. So, it just struck me as a hit piece. But those happen. Microsoft and every other significant tech company in the world has seen those in the past. Or we can look at real issues, like there are real issues with export control and those kinds of things that that have hit the wire in the last day as well. So there's all kinds of things like this that happen out there. Obviously, we watch for these kinds of issues, determine if there's any real impact. In this case, I don't see any real impact, not to people on the platform or what have you.
And I mean, they didn't ask us for comment in the article, and most of the people who are Microsoft didn't comment on it because, like you can tell, there's more to the story. In my experience, talking to a lot of the people who are involved in that process, I did not think that the story got the whole story, because there's two sides to every story. And when I would talk to the people at Microsoft about that whole saga, about them waiting to get their FedRAMP certification, the story I heard was they were bending over backwards trying to get these meetings with the FedRAMP office. And as the article said, there's nobody in the office. And so when there's no one in the office and the people who are there keep rotating out, and then all of a sudden years go by and nothing's occurring, there's just a whole other dynamic in terms of what's going on. So read it, form your opinion, but take it with a grain of salt, like anything else, just like you might hear from us on things like this. Okay, regarding FAR, DFARS rewrite is in progress. I don't recall specifically which FAR DFARS off the top of my head. I think this was in regards to talking about 7012 rulemaking and things like that. We did a podcast on this in terms of the FAR overhaul. Probably going to do another one because there's lots of questions about it. The revolutionary FAR overhaul, first major overhaul of the federal acquisition regulation in its 40-plus year history, which is kind of insane that they haven't done any of that. What they're doing is allegedly what they're doing is going through and they're removing anything that doesn't have a statutory requirement, anything that's sort of shown up in the regulation over time that didn't have a statutory basis as its legal basis. They're taking out, they're rewriting it to make it more efficient, straightforward. Laudable goal here. Did a pretty good job, in my opinion. So we did an episode about this because this also trickles down to the supplements to the FAR, like the DFARS, the DOD's supplement to the Federal Acquisition Regulation. The way that this impacts defense contractors is your FAR 52-204-21 clause, the language is unchanged, but the number has changed. It is now FAR 52-240-93. In terms of DFARS obligations, the DFARS 7012 clause, unchanged. The CMMC clause and provision, 7021 and 7025, unchanged. DFARS 7019 has gone away because it duplicated the self-assessment requirements by CMMC level 2, if that is your requirement. So there's no reason to make people do a CMMC level 2 self-assessment and a DFARS 7019 basic self-assessment. So they got rid of 7019. 7020 is still around. It was renumbered, if I believe it's now 252247993, if I remember correctly.
997.
7997.
Yep.
It's a live show, everybody. We're still working on it. And yeah, so we did a podcast a little while ago. It's got the gravestones on the thumbnail to get everybody to click on it. Shout out to producer Dustin for that one. So check that one out, Brett, and it's got some more information in there.
So there was a comment there from LinkedIn user, if you want to address that one. Yeah, this one, now this is one that I had a real problem with. The ProPublica article that just came out, I think that's just smoke looking for a fire. It's not real. But this one, this was a real issue. This situation where Microsoft was escorting the digital escort program, escorting people with certain high-level skill sets that Microsoft didn't have in spades into the government platform to do work, using a U.S. engineer to escort a non-U.S. engineer, in some cases Chinese nationals, into the environment to do that. That was a real problem. However, that is a real problem that was approved by DoD. DoD did approve that process, that digital escort process. Now, we can argue all day long if DoD should have approved that digital escort process. I have my opinions, but it was approved by DoD. That program has been ended and is no longer in process. They no longer have digital escorts for non-U.S. persons that are in the environment. So.
Yes,
kudos to Microsoft. Kudos to Microsoft for ending the program when it was brought up and questioned, but they were not doing it without DoD's knowledge.
Well, and I mean, do you guys notice a pattern here? When the ProPublica article comes out around the FedRAMP approval of GCC High, Microsoft does not throw the FedRAMP office under the bus. When the digital escort program article comes out, Microsoft does not throw the DoD under the bus, right? So you're not getting the complete story. It makes total sense why Microsoft doesn't throw their biggest and best customer under the bus. Hello, right? They're not going to come out and be like, hey, here's exactly what we did because these people over here said it was totally fine. People in the DoD CIO's office have been fired as a result of that escort program. If you've been watching Twitter and some of the recent news about changes in personnel, that's why they got shown the door, is because of approvals or governance of this issue. If you remember, I'll try to find the link to it. As a result of that story coming out, the Secretary of Defense put out a memo that said, hey, one of the things that we're going to do to secure cybersecurity and supply chain is CMMC. We've never had a SecDef level memo endorsing the CMMC program until that story came out. So make of it what you will from a big picture, but as far as it impacts actual contractors, the only thing that story did was reinforce the nature of the CMMC program downstream from issues like that. So it's important for context, it's important for everybody's civic participation. But as far as extrapolating consequences for programs like CMC, be careful about saying bad thing happened, therefore this associated downstream program will also have some sort of issue. It was actually quite the opposite. I gotta look that up. We did a podcast on it, but I think it was last summer that memo came out. So we'll maybe revisit that because this story keeps coming up. Okay, let's see here. Where did we leave off? We talked about when 171 Rev 3 is going to be required. Keep your ear to the ground for rulemaking updates because that's going to be when we have we're able to tighten the estimate on when we might see that in the future.
So there's a question here along that line from Blue Siren. If you have a GSA and a DoD contract, would Rev 3 be the best option? Yeah, I mean, that's the high watermark, right? Rev 3 is just enhancements to Rev 2. So if you go ahead and update your infrastructure to Rev 3 and you're meeting all the Rev 3 client requirements, make sure you keep your mapping back to R2 because that's who the C3PAO that's what they're gonna use when they come in to do your assessment. So make sure you keep things mapped back to R2 as well. But if you implement R3, there's no reason why you can't be compliant with both R2 and R3 at the same time.
Yeah, and a good interim step for that, if you want to, prepare for Rev 3, but you don't want to do the full implementation, is to use the 171 Rev 3 organizationally defined parameters for your 172 or 171 Rev 2 implementation. So, contrary to popular belief, there are organizationally defined parameters that have to be defined and specified, and all those things in 171 Rev 2. The DoD just doesn't tell you what those things are supposed to be. You get to pick what those things are going to be. So you can pick whatever you want, but if you want to work towards Rev 3 without actually doing Rev 3, just take the values that they're going to specify via rulemaking. They've already published the list on the CIO's website of what they plan on those values to be. You can implement 171 Rev 2 with those values, and then the transition won't be as big of a deal because a lot of those controls are exactly the same in Rev 3, and then your values and configurations will be one for one. So it's not as big of a gap if you approach it from that direction. Let's see here. Okay. Good question. This was a question that came up on the recent Small Business Administration listening session that everybody got together for. And it actually hits on a DoD policy and a government-wide CUI policy that has been in effect for a long, long time, since way before CMMC. And the question was, why is there no company size requirement for CMMC? Companies under 5 employees should have a different baseline or threshold than the mega Lockheeds of the world. Perfectly valid argument. However, it is the policy of the federal government that there is a minimum floor for protecting the confidentiality of CUI, regardless of the type or size of an environment that you put that data into. So if an individual is holding a piece of CUI, or a multi-billion-dollar defense corporation is holding that same piece of CUI, that does not affect the minimum requirement for protecting the data's confidentiality. The value and sensitivity of the data at a minimum doesn't change depending on the size of the organization that it enters into. They've been very consistent about this policy for literally decades at this point, and it makes sense. The problem is that, like a flat tax, anytime you have a minimum baseline, it's regressive the smaller that you get, right? So a flat tax for super rich people isn't a big deal. It is a big deal for people who are not rich, right? So even though it seems fair because it's the baseline across the board, it's a bigger relative burden on people who have fewer resources. Same thing here. If you have a minimum baseline, then if you have fewer resources, it seems like a relatively larger problem than somebody who has a ton of resources, unless you're Stryker, am I right? So why does CMMC not have a difference? It's because the baseline that's being verified by CMMC isn't any different. If you have one piece of CUI that triggers the requirements in DFARS 7012 and also triggers the requirement for a third-party assessment, it doesn't matter that you're a one-person shop. It doesn't matter that you're a 100-person shop. It doesn't matter that you're a 10,000-person shop. The DoD wants that minimum level of assurance. And until that government-wide policy changes, which I see no future timeline in my Dr. Strange prediction here of that ever changing, then it's just going to be a relatively larger burden for smaller organizations.
Well, DoD has recognized that as well. And there are some programs that DoD is putting in place to try and help address that. Specifically, the Army is coming out with a contract called ENCODE, Next Generation Collaboration of Defended Enclaves, I believe is what it stands for. But essentially, it is a small business environment that is meant for companies 10 employees and smaller to be able to meet the technical requirements. You're still going to have the policies. You still have to get your own certification and all of that, but it does help you with the technical implementation of the protection mechanisms for 800-171. And that contract is, they're expecting to do an award, I believe, in the next 60 days for pilot programs for that. That pilot lasts for about 6 months. So we're probably going to look at a production rollout of that sometime in 2027. Yeah. And it really is targeted toward, 10 user companies, 10-person companies and smaller. The way it's sized right now, the Army is looking at trying to support about 6,000 companies at around 10 users per. So roughly 60,000 users supported by that Encode solution. And so we'll see what happens with that.
Yeah.
We'll see how that goes.
And that really is the appropriate answer, right? So the wrong answer is to say this is a relatively larger burden for small companies, so we should reduce the baseline of requirements in different environments. That's not a good idea, right? The baseline being reduced further than what it is not going to help the problem of securing the data. Offsetting the relative burden for smaller organizations and environments is how you approach that. So we spent a long time going through this debate over the years about the minimum requirements need to be minimumer, if you will, for smaller organizations. That does not help the reason why we're all doing this. You have to offset the burden rather than try to arbitrarily reduce it, because those baselines they really can't be reduced any further in any kind of a justifiable way here.
Yeah, it's just like so many of the conversations we have in this world is follow the data. It's all about where is the data flowing, and the data has to be protected, and they've defined what that protection level is.
Yeah. All righty. Well, talking more about influence and control here, Brad, this is a conversation I think you have somewhat often in terms of FOCI. What is FOCI? What are the restrictions around FOCI? What exactly is foreign influence and control considerations here, how it overlaps with export control? I think you have this conversation pretty often, right?
Yeah, so I actually have experience with working with FOCI. So in a previous life, I was the IT director for a defense company that was under FOCI. And so we dealt with, we were owned by a company in Scotland, and we dealt with a lot of foreign nationals. You had to have your TAA done and make sure that all the subcontractors were on it and everybody is approved to work with that on that project and have be able to hold the data, see the data, all that kind of stuff. Again, follow data, right? But you have to make sure that that company, that foreign company that owns your entity, is not influencing or controlling. And I have seen that where if somebody, let's say in the US based entity is, maybe they get pissed off about something, or maybe something happens. They feel that the parent company is telling them, hey, no, you can't do that, or you have to do this or whatever. They can go to the DoD and raise a red flag and actually pull their facility clearance so that they can't hold that data or process that data anymore, and you could lose the contract. So it's really, really touchy, really sensitive, and there's a lot of eyes on it when you're in that situation. I've talked to a few others that were maybe an IT director or worked for a company that was under FOCI, and they ran into the same exact issue. It is not something that a lot of foreign entities understand or accept very, I will say, nicely. Like sometimes you have to tell them, kick rocks, you got to leave us alone and let us do our thing. And we have to follow these rules over here. You guys just provide the money, right? Which you can always, influence and control through finances. But, that is also something you have to be very careful of as well.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Awesome. Let's see here. John says GSA is still using FOUO classification for data, even though FOUO is not supposed to be used. And they want to know how we will protect FOUO and SSI data if we win the bid, we being CMMC level 2 C3 PAO certified. Yeah, it's a big problem. So the federal-wide CUI program requires that all of the individual agencies have their own governance over their internal CUI program. So DoD has their CUI program, GSA has their CUI program, so on and so forth. As we all know, the implementation and governance of those programs is pretty hit or miss, even though we're now a decade into the CUI era, if you will. So a lot of these organizations are still marking FOUO. This gets back to your point earlier, Brad, about the fact that this comes down to your willingness to negotiate. Let's see here. Let me get this banner off. Your willingness to negotiate. If they're telling you that you have to protect CUI and they're sending you a bunch of data marked FOUO, are you or are you not going to then go into the conversation about we don't have any CUI. You're not sending us any CUI. None of this data is marked as CUI. A lot of people don't want to have that conversation. They don't want to push back on their customer. They don't have the resources to do it. They don't want to hire an attorney in order to navigate that process. Various valid reasons. But if you are on that side of the fence, you don't have much of a choice, right? And you're going to have to then scope your environment according to what you think the data ought to be. We just had this conversation in Fort Worth, Scott, about, well, Brad, you were there too. There was a bunch of people there. We just had this conversation in Fort Worth about your C3PAO is not there to tell you that your scoping was right or wrong, right? Your C3PAO there is to check your work. And so you have a lot of, Scott disappeared.
You didn't like that conversation.
Yeah. I'm sure he'll be back.
Yeah.
You have a lot of liberties in terms of scoping your environment, in terms of what the data flow ought to be, especially because if you zoom out far enough, you're not technically supposed to have any of the controlled data until after you have proven via either self-assessment or third-party assessment that you have the control environment in place to then have the data flow into. So you should be able to scope and implement and assess an environment without ever having the data, right? So you don't necessarily have to have the data to know how to scope the environment. It actually kind of makes it a little bit more complicated if you have existing data flows and they aren't marked correctly, and then you're trying to figure out how to then appropriately scope everything. So you're getting marked FOUO and marked SSI. My generic response is do you or do you not want to do this negotiation process back and forth in order to drill down on the nature of that data? If not, you still have a lot of opportunity to aggressively minimize the scope of that data because there really isn't a right answer. If you do, like you said, Brad, it's going to take a lot of time. And so just make sure that you plan accordingly if you are facing not a lot of time. You know what I mean?
Well, it's expensive either way, right? It's either you push back and spend the time doing that and resources to do that, or you spend money to make sure that you're securing more data the right way. We had the same conversation when I was at CMMC Northeast in Rhode Island, had the same exact kind of conversation. It was like, they're sending us ITAR. Why are they sending us ITAR? We're not supposed to have ITAR, that kind of stuff. And they're saying, well, just treat everything as CUI. It's like, no.
Yeah, easy for you to say.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, and John, if I'm interested to know too, if you hear back from them, what do they say about your CMMC level 2 C3 PAO cert? Are they accepting it? Because the guidance in that GSA policy that they put out was they're willing to accept alternatives to the GSA process. They don't name CMMC, but I would love to know what kind of response you get back from them. All righty. Let's see. Does Summit 7 sell a less costly product similar to Prevail? Microsoft GCC High is so expensive. Brad, you could jump in here in a second. So GCC High isn't required in order to meet the requirements of DFARS 7012 and to achieve a CMMC status. Whether or not GCC High is the option that you should consider is determined by the nature of the data. So if you have export control data sovereignty considerations, there are very few cloud environments that can handle the export control ITAR requirements for that specific data. So less costly products to GCC High is dependent on the nature of the data that we're talking about. So if you don't have export controlled considerations, if you don't have data sovereignty considerations, you don't need GCC High. We, of course, can still help you. If you do have export control and data sovereignty considerations, then GCC High is one of the things that you're going to have to consider. Even though there's other options out there that can handle it, there's just not that many. What do you think here, Brad?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, obviously, like you said, there are other means of sharing information, but especially if you're already in GCC High, it looks like this question was asked from somebody who's not. There's a lot of benefits to being in GCC High. Obviously, the productivity tools and everything that you get from Microsoft in that realm, it brings a lot of benefits, but having let's say a B2B connection in GCC High between other GCC High tenants, or now you can even do cross cloud B2B. There's a lot of benefits to that, and not just file sharing, but also teams and other things. So while you don't have to be in GCC High, and yes, can be more expensive, but it depends on what your requirements are.
Yeah, exactly. Awesome point here. All right, well, let's see. We had another one. Let's see if I scroll. There's another one that was in the queue that sounds related. Is GCCI the only option for ITAR, EAR, export control data? No, it is not. There are other options from other companies in terms of data sovereignty, allowable cloud offerings, but there aren't very many. So, we specialize in the Microsoft tech stack, so that's GCCI is the answer for that. It's not the only option, but if you are dealing with export control requirements, that's not imposed on you by CMMC. It's not imposed on you by DFARS 7012. That is an ITAR, export control regulation issue. And so you would have had that issue whether CMMC was ever a thing or not. And so you just have fewer options, but there are other options. There's just not very many.
Yeah, it goes back to your requirements. I mean, if you have requirements to be able to collaborate on documents and use productivity tools, I think there's only one other option out there that can do that. So there's very few options on the market that meet that requirement.
Let's see here. I guess maybe a good rule of thumb on the options in terms of export control data, none of the commercial offerings are going to work. So that just wipe those off the board, and then you kind of get an idea of how few options there are, because you can't put export control information into commercial cloud offerings. Like, they're just not built to handle those kinds of requirements there. All righty. Why did the Department of War switch from the NIST standard to CMMC? Okay. The way that I like to frame this for everybody is that CMMC is the program that verifies the NIST standards. Those NIST standards are imposed on you by existing DoD contract clauses. So they did not switch from a NIST standard to CMMC. CMMC is the verification mechanism for those NIST standards. So imagine CMMC doesn't exist for a moment. You're a defense contractor, you win a contract. Part of your contract terms says if you handle our controlled information, Department of War's controlled information, then you have cybersecurity requirements pursuant to DFARS Clause 252-204-7012. Part of that requirement is implementing NIST SP 800-171. Another part of that requirement is if you're going to put that data in the cloud, it has to be at least equivalent to FedRAMP moderate. If that data is export controlled, like we were just talking about, you have other considerations in terms of data sovereignty. You can't put it into commercial cloud offerings, even if those commercial cloud offerings are FedRAMP. So there's a bunch of cascading requirements that have existed, still exist, will continue to exist. CMMC is there to verify that the NIST 800-171 portion has been implemented correctly. Because if you are familiar with the history of the development of the program, there is no verification mechanism in DFARS 7012. It's just you sign the paper and accept the contract and you pinky promise that you're complying. Turns out that's not a very good policy. Congress and the department wanted better assurance that people were actually doing this stuff, so they created a program to verify that standard. Now, way back in the day, if you want to get into the details, CMMC 1.0 circa 2020, 2021 added some additional requirements on top of the NIST standard because they wanted to plug some of the holes that are in that baseline standard. All of that went away with CMMC 2.0. So these days, those 20 extra controls are not a thing. The only time that changes is when NIST changes the baseline. So CMMC these days is directly aligned with the NIST standard imposed on you by your contract. It's not a separate standard. It's not a separate baseline. They did not switch from NIST to CMMC. They're actually verifying NIST through CMMC. Let's see here. 800-171 is law. CMMC is governance for 800-171. Yeah, you can look at it that way. If anybody's familiar with the NIST risk management framework, RMF process, way you can think about this is the government tailored the baseline that they wanted, and that is 800-171. They assumed that companies were implementing it around step 3 of the RMF. There was no assessment and verification, so they were by default giving you authorization to handle their data And then they were assuming that the continuous monitoring of the environment was happening. As you can tell, that's a lot of assumptions. That's a lot of just, yep, we're good, we're good, we're good. So CMMC came in as the verification step that you would have had prior to producing your security assessment report. So just depends on which lens you want to look at in terms of what it's doing. It's an assurance mechanism to make sure that you're implementing those baselines. All righty. If I have a CMMC certification and later I have an open POAM item or open POAM items, do I lose my certification? This was related to another question that was in the queue for what is a POAM? Okay. You got a baseline of cybersecurity requirements. We call that baseline in this context, NIST Special Publication 800-171. The government is expecting you to implement all of those requirements. Sometimes through refreshing your environment, upgrading your environment, changing configurations, adding, removing, people leave, people come in, whatever, just operating and existing your control environment, stuff falls out of implementation. The only way you know that is when you do an assessment of the environment and say, is this implemented? Is that implemented? Is this implemented? If you have findings that say this isn't implemented, you make a plan to implement them, a plan of actions and milestones. When are we going to fix it? What is it that we need to fix? So on and so forth. That is referred to as a POAM. So this is very standard. You check and make sure, you do your diagnostic check, your annual assessment, whatever you want to call it, whatever your open findings are, you make a plan to burn them down and have them implemented. That's called your POAM. That's how you manage those open items. Rinse and repeat, so on and so forth until the end of time. So when it comes to CMMC, the problem was that before CMMC, people could abuse what was known as the POAM loophole. They assess themselves, they park their open items on the POAM. There's no requirement for them to actually close those open items by any certain date. It was just assumed that companies, out of their own rational self-interest, would want to close those open items. But closing open items takes time and money and effort and buy-in, and so they just sometimes don't get implemented. And that's a big problem because the DoD has a very big interest in making sure that you have implemented the requirements to protect their data. So they came up with this idea of you're going to go through a CMMC assessment. The findings from that assessment are going to go on a CMMC POAM. There are very specific rules about what's allowed to be a finding as a result of a CMMC assessment that you go through every 3 years. You can find this in the CMMC regulation 32 CFR 170. And basically, they take all of those requirements in 800-171 and they break them into 3 buckets. They say these ones are worth 5 points each. These ones are worth 3 points each. These ones are worth 1 point each. None of the 5-pointers, none of the 3-pointers, and only some of the 1-pointers cannot be on a POAM. You have to have them all implemented when you go through your assessment. Some of them.
How many of those POAMs, Jacob, were 110 lines long?
Yeah, none of them, right? Yeah. So there's a very, very small window of things that could possibly be unimplemented as a result of your CMMC assessment. Not a big deal. You get a conditional status. You got 6 months to close those items on your CMMC POAM. You still have the requirement in 171 to manage open items as you go through your routine control assessments on your own in between your triennial CMMC assessments. And you're going to find open items. They now call those operational POAMs. So you will not lose your certification if you go through your standard assessment, your annual assessment, your quarterly assessment, however often you do it, and you find an open item and you had a CMMC status. Caveat here, if you are one of the lucky ones and you get to do a CMMC level 2 self-assessment, you are still under the same rules as a third-party assessment in the sense that you can't have any open 5-pointers, you can't have any open 3-pointers as a result of your official CMMC self-assessment. So be very careful about giving yourself a final status because there's nobody else to blame if there's an issue later on because you're the one that said that as a result of our assessments, everything is fully implemented.
Yeah, if you are missing the MFA pointer, then you might as well just stop what you're doing, Start over.
Yep, it's just a process for managing, the living environment that is your control setup over time. Not a big deal. Not a big deal. Let's see here. Self-assessment is just lies. The lies. Yeah, so it's not a it's not a viable long-term policy, which is why fewer companies have level 2 self-assessment requirements than I think that they had led themselves to believe. DoD has put out policy on this in January of 2025, saying that of all of the various flavors of CUI that you could possibly have, if you have the defense-specific flavors of CUI, the minimum requirement is CMMC level 2 certification via a C3PAO. If for some reason you're dealing with other flavors of CUI as a result of a defense contract, then the minimum requirement is level 2 self-assessment. So if you're dealing with putting parts on missiles, parts on planes, stuff in space, things like that, there's a good chance you're going to end up with a level 2 certification assessment rather than a level 2 self-assessment. Your mileage may vary. Just be aware that that's what's happening to a lot of people out there. Whew. All right. We are already at an hour. It flies by every time. Brad,
yeah, sounds like Scott lost power. Huntsville lost power, so they dropped, and he said he didn't think that they were going to make it back in time. So
yeah, well,
that sucks. I love having Scott here, but things happen, right?
Yeah, we'll see him. We'll see him again soon. We got to have you on again soon as well, Brad. We never have enough time, even though we do a full hour of just questions. So if we didn't get to your question, we'll add it to the queue for future episodes. If you find this stream after it's over, you can always leave a question or a comment, and then we'll also add that to the queue. You go to CUIHotline.org, fill out the form, leave voicemail at the real working phone number up there if you want to, and we'll add it to what's going on. Thanks for tuning in, everybody, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks for having me.